Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're going way back to medieval India. We're going to be looking at two of the biggest powers of the time,
Yeah.
the Vijayanagara Empire down south and the
Yeah.
Delhi Sultanate
Okay.
up north. So we're roughly talking about 1336 to 1646 for Vijayanagara
Okay.
and 1206 to 1526
Okay.
for the Delhi Sultanate.
All right.
I think it'll be really interesting to compare how they governed, their
Yeah.
cultural approaches, even how they fought their wars.
It's going to be fascinating because it's not just rulers and battles, right?
Right.
I think we can really uncover the lasting impact of these two totally different approaches to basically running an empire, and we'll see how those differences really played out, on the ground.
Yeah, I'm really excited to jump in. So let's start at the beginning.
Okay.
The Delhi Sultanate.
Right.
Now, they were established by invaders from Central Asia,
Right.
right there in the heart of the Indo-Gangetic Plain.
Yeah.
I mean, this is an area that
Yeah.
has seen so many empires rise and fall over the centuries. So what is it about this location that's so significant?
Well,
And how did it influence the Sultanate?
I think that location's key, right? So that Indo-Gangetic Plain, incredibly fertile. I mean, it's always been a prime target for empire builders,
Makes sense.
So the Delhi Sultanate, they inherit this legacy of all these powerful empires, Indian empires, foreign empires. And that really shaped how they thought about governance. They really needed a strong centralized system if they were going to hold on to such a valuable piece of territory.
So they came in with a take charge attitude.
Yeah.
Now, meanwhile,
Right.
down south, the Vijayanagara Empire emerges.
Yeah.
Now, they weren't about conquest, though, were they?
No, not at all. Vijayanagara, they were really born out of a need to protect, Hindu traditions. I mean, imagine, right, founding an entire empire just to safeguard your culture.
Right.
And they were strategic too, right? So they positioned themselves south of the Krishna River, which is this natural barrier, right, against the Sultanate's influence up north. It's almost like they were playing chess,
Right.
making these calculated moves to secure their interests.
So I'm starting to see how these different origins, really shaped their styles. So a take charge attitude up north,
Right.
more of a defensive posture down south.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how that played out in terms of their governance.
Right.
Now, the Delhi Sultanate, they were all about centralized power.
Yeah.
Right? The Sultan was the ultimate authority.
Absolutely. So it's like a pyramid structure with the Sultan at the very top.
Okay.
And they had this system called Iqtas, these land grants that they used to reward nobles for being loyal. It was a way to, delegate power, but also make sure that everybody ultimately answered to the Sultan.
So those Ikas, were they basically like little mini kingdoms within the Sultanate?
I mean, they weren't exactly independent kingdoms, but they did give those nobles a lot of power. And sometimes it would cause problems, right? If a sultan was weak or indecisive, those nobles, they could get too powerful and start challenging the sultan.
So it sounds like it could get pretty unstable
Right.
pretty quickly.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, a strong sultan keeps the nobles in check, right? But if you have a weak sultan, well, his power starts slipping away pretty fast. And that tension between, the central authority and those powerful regional figures, that was a theme throughout the entire Delhi Sultanate.
Yeah, I can imagine. Now, down south,
Right.
Vijayanagara, they took a very different approach.
Yeah, much more decentralized.
Right. Tell me a little about their system.
So Vijayanagara, it wasn't so much top-down control. It was more about building a network of alliances. So they had these Nayakas. These were powerful feudal lords, and they pledged allegiance to the Vijayanagara rulers, right? But unlike the Sultanate's, Iqta system, these Nayakas, they had a lot of autonomy.
So it was more like a web of power
Yeah.
than a pyramid.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. So Vijayanagara, they relied on collaboration, right? Cooperation between that central authority and these powerful regional lords. And it worked.
Yeah.
So this system, it let them adapt to, all the diverse needs and cultures of southern India. Which makes sense, right? I mean, the region had such a varied landscape and a long history of independent kingdoms.
So we have these two contrasting models of governance.
Right.
Centralized power in the Delhi Sultanate,
Uh-huh.
a more decentralized, more collaborative system in Vijayanagara.
Yeah.
Now, these differences, these weren't just limited to politics, were they?
Not even a little bit. These ways of governing, they also influenced their culture, their attitudes towards religion, even the way they built their armies.
Okay, this is where things start to get really interesting.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about those cultural and religious differences.
All right, so let's start with the Delhi Sultanate. They were this really interesting mix of Islamic and pre-existing Indian traditions.
Okay.
They brought their own faith and cultural practices, but they also had to, adapt to a largely Hindu population.
Right.
And one way they did that was by adopting Persian as their official language.
Which makes sense, right? You need a common language if you're going to run an empire.
Exactly. And, some of those early sultans, they were known to destroy Hindu temples.
Wow.
But later rulers, they actually became a lot more tolerant.
Really?
Yeah, they realized they needed to coexist.
So it sounds like there was a bit of a cultural tug-of-war going on.
For sure.
Like they had to assert their own identity, but also acknowledge the existing cultures.
Exactly. And you can even see it in their architecture. So take the Quwwat-ul-Islam Mosque in Delhi, for instance. It's built on a temple site, right, and uses all these materials from demolished temples. Just picture that, right, like a mosque built with the remnants of another faith.
That is a powerful image. I mean, what does that tell us about the power dynamics at play?
It really makes you think, right?
Yeah.
Like, was it just a sign of dominance?
Yeah.
Or was it more practical? Like they were just, being resourceful?
Yeah, maybe a bit of both.
Probably.
It makes you think about all the layers of history present in a single structure. Now, Vijayanagara, they were champions of Hindu culture.
Yes.
Weren't they?
Yeah, they were.
So how did their policies compare to the sultanates?
Well, the Vijayanagara rulers, they were all about reviving, promoting Hindu traditions. So they invested in temple building. They supported all these Hindu scholars. They even revived ancient texts. Their goal was to preserve their cultural heritage, because it was threatened by that sultanate expansion.
So their cultural policies were kind of a direct reflection of their origins.
Yeah.
A response to the sultanate being up in the north.
For sure.
But did they persecute other religions? Were they as intolerant as some of those early sultans?
No. Interestingly enough, no. I mean, they were focused on promoting Hinduism, but they weren't hostile to other faiths. Like, they tolerated Jains, for example.
Right.
And their empire, it was actually really diverse. It reflected all the many different cultures and traditions of southern India.
So two very different approaches to culture and religion, each shaped by their own kind of unique circumstances and goals. But this wasn't just about politics and culture, was it?
Yep.
And these empires, they also had to fight wars. So how did their military strategies compare?
Well, that's where it gets really, really interesting. Their differences in, geography, resources, even their cultural attitudes, they all shaped their military strategies. So the Delhi Sultanate, they relied heavily on cavalry, which was typical, of those Central Asian armies. And they were known for their swift raids, maneuverability, and that style really suited those open plains of northern India.
So horses were their key to success.
Pretty much.
But wouldn't that make them vulnerable? What if they couldn't get enough horses?
Right. It was both a strength and a weakness, right?
Yeah.
Control of those, horse breeding regions, trade routes, that was vital to their military power.
Okay.
But Vijayanagara, down south, they had a different ace up their sleeve.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What was their secret weapon?
Elephants. Vijayanagara, they were famous for their massive elephant armies. Yeah, those creatures, they could be terrifying on a battlefield. Just imagine facing a charging elephant.
I can only imagine. But weren't elephants a bit, I don't know, slow and clumsy?
Yeah.
Especially in close combat?
Yeah. They weren't exactly known for, their speed and agility.
Right.
But they were powerful.
Yeah.
They could trample enemy formations. And the psychological impact, you can't overstate that, right?
No, I could imagine.
And think about the terrain of southern India, right? With those dense forests and hills. Not exactly ideal for cavalry.
Right.
But elephants, they could navigate those landscapes much more effectively.
So the choice of elephants wasn't just a cultural preference.
Right.
It was a practical one.
Exactly. It was a strategy that played to their strengths.
All right, so we've got these two empires.
Yeah.
The Delhi Sultanate and Vijayanagara. Both powerful in their own right.
Right.
But with such different approaches to governance.
Yeah.
Culture and even warfare.
Yeah.
It's like comparing apples and oranges.
Yeah. That's what makes it so fascinating, right? There's no single narrative here. No, like, right or wrong way to build an empire. It's just these two different models, each shaped by, their own historical, geographical, cultural context.
It really highlights the diversity and the complexity of medieval India.
Yeah, for sure.
So far we've been looking at, the big picture stuff. Origins, governance, culture, military strategy. But what about the everyday lives of people in these empires? How did these systems play out on the ground?
That's a great question, and that's what we're going to get into next.
Okay.
We're going to delve into their social structures, their economies, and really look at how these different systems impacted the lives of ordinary people.
I'm ready to dive deeper. Let's uncover more about this fascinating world of the Delhi Sultanate and the Vijayanagara Empire.
Let's do it. Okay, so last time we talked about, like, the big picture stuff, right?
Yeah.
Origins, how they governed, culture, military stuff. Now, let's shift our focus a bit to the social structures that kind of underpinned these empires. So, as we saw, the Delhi Sultanate, very hierarchical, right?
Yeah.
Clear chain of command stemming from the Sultan.
Right. And you mentioned those Iqtas, those land grants given to nobles. They played a big role.
Huge role, yeah.
In maintaining that whole hierarchy.
Absolutely.
Sounds like a pretty sweet deal for those nobles. Land, power. I mean, what's not to like?
Right.
But I imagine it wasn't always like easy street at the top.
No.
What were some of the challenges they faced?
Well, you're right. Those Iqtas, attractive, but a lot of responsibility came with them. They weren't just, sitting around enjoying the perks. They were tasked with collecting taxes, maintaining order in their territories, providing military support to the Sultan. Imagine you're a noble, suddenly you're in charge of this huge region. You've got bandits to deal with, rival nobles trying to, encroach on your territory. And then, of course, you've got to keep the Sultan happy.
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure. And if a sultan was weak or indecisive, I imagine that would make things even tougher.
Absolutely. Weak sultan equals a less stable sultanate.
Yeah.
And that instability, it could trickle down and create chaos for everybody.
Yeah.
Especially those nobles trying to keep things in order. It was a system that really relied on a strong leader.
So what about everyone else?
Yeah.
Where did they fit into this hierarchy? What was life like for, the merchants, the artisans, the farmers?
Okay, so below those nobles, you had this vast, diverse population, right? Merchants, artisans, farmers, laborers, religious scholars, administrators. They were all crucial in keeping the Sultanate running.
This complex tapestry of people all playing their part in this grand imperial system. Now, the Sultan, they didn't just invent this whole social structure, right? They inherited a lot from previous Indian empires.
They did. They inherited this, complex social structure that had already evolved over centuries in India. They adapted it, modified it to fit their needs, but they weren't working with a blank slate. One key thing they adopted was the jati system.
The jati system, what was that exactly?
So think of jatis as occupational groups, kind of like guilds, but with a hereditary element. And they were a fundamental part of Indian society, both north and south. So you'd have jatis for weavers, blacksmiths, merchants, you name it. They regulated social and economic life, ensuring those skills would be passed down.
So it wasn't just about what you did, but also who your family was.
Yeah.
Did everyone belong to a jati?
Pretty much. It was a system that permeated all levels of society. Even the Sultan and his nobles, they were associated with specific jatis.
Interesting. So very structured social hierarchy in the Delhi Sultanate. Now, Vijayanagara, with its decentralized system, their social structure must have been a bit different.
Yes. So with that emphasis on regional autonomy, Vijayanagara's social structure, more fluid, more varied across different regions. Those Nayakas, those feudal lords, remember?
Yeah.
They had a lot of power in their territories. They had their own courts, their own armies, their own systems of administration.
So more like a collection of mini kingdoms, all swearing allegiance to the Vijayanagara Emperor.
Yeah, that's a good way to visualize it. And this allowed for more diversity, more flexibility within their society. The jatis still existed, but they weren't as rigid. More room for social mobility and local customs and traditions. They often held more weight than, imperial dictates.
So two different approaches to social organization, each reflecting their distinct political models.
Exactly.
Now, no empire can function without a strong economy, right? So let's talk about how these empires manage their finances, their trade, how those policies impacted everyday people.
Yeah, economics, it's key to understanding how these empires thrived. So the Delhi Sultanate, with that centralized system, they had a really tight grip on trade and revenue. They'd established these trade monopolies, giving them control over things like spices, textiles, precious metals.
So they were calling the shots when it came to trade. Did that create opportunities for certain
I
people?
did, yeah.
Were there downsides? Like, was there a risk of exploitation?
Oh, for sure. Control over trade, that created opportunities for merchants and artisans who were connected to those powerful networks. They had access to these lucrative markets. They could benefit from those policies. But you're right. There was a risk of exploitation.
Especially for those who weren't part of those networks. What about the farmers? I mean, they're the backbone of any agricultural society.
Right.
How did they fare under the Sultanate's policies?
Farmers, they were essential. The Sultanate, they depended on them, right?
Right.
To produce food, raw materials, everything that fueled their economy. And the demand for agricultural goods, that was created by those trade monopolies, so there was definitely a market for their produce. But they were also subject to really heavy taxation. Remember, those land taxes, those were a key source of revenue for the Sultanate.
So kind of a double-edged sword for the farmers.
Mm-hmm.
Potential for profit, but also the burden of those taxes.
Yeah.
And those taxes, they weren't always fairly applied, were they?
No, unfortunately not. There were definitely cases of corruption, abuse of power. Those at the bottom, they often suffered the most when things weren't fair. It reminds us that these policies, even if they're well-intentioned, can have unintended consequences, especially for those who are already vulnerable.
Yeah, for sure. It sounds like a complex and nuanced picture.
Very much so, yeah.
What about Vijayanagara? How did their more decentralized system, how did that influence their economic policies? Did they have those same issues with, exploitation and unfair taxation?
Well, Vijayanagara, their approach was more, I guess you could say, multifaceted.
Oh,
They really encouraged agricultural production, especially cash crops, cotton, spices, things that were in high demand in those international markets. They also had this sophisticated taxation system with revenue collected at different levels of their administration. Those Nayakas, remember?
Yeah.
They played a key role in managing those local economies.
So a more hands-off approach compared to that tight grip of the Sultanate. Does that mean they were less susceptible to corruption?
Well, it's hard to say for sure whether one system was inherently more or less corrupt. Corruption, it can exist anywhere, right? Vijayanagara's system, though, that decentralized model, it did allow for more regional variation, local control, which in theory could make it harder for corruption to spread, but it also meant there was less oversight.
Yeah.
Less accountability at the top. It really depended on the character of those in charge at each level.
It always comes down to the people in charge.
Yeah, doesn't it?
But overall, it seems like Vijayanagara's economic policies were more focused on growth and prosperity within their empire rather than just, controlling trade and extracting revenue.
You could say that. They understood that a thriving economy, it relied on the well-being of its people, not just hoarding wealth at the top.
So two different approaches to economics, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. But we're not just talking about abstract models here, right? We're talking about real people, their families, their livelihoods, their communities. What was the impact of these policies on everyday life?
That's a crucial point. We can't just look at these policies in isolation. We have to consider their social impact, how they affected people's lives, and that's something we'll explore even more in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, I'm eager to hear more about that. Let's dive into the human side of these empires and see how these grand systems played out in the lives of everyday people. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, right? Those grand systems of governance, economics. But now I want to zoom in a bit. See how all that actually impacted the lives of people in these empires, both in the Delhi Sultanate and Vijayanagara. What were their daily experiences like?
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that both of these empires, they existed in a larger global context, right? They weren't just these isolated islands. They were connected by these, vast trade networks. And that means goods and ideas, even people, they were constantly moving across borders.
So we're not just talking about two separate empires,
Right.
but also how they interacted with the wider world.
Exactly. And those interactions, they really had a profound impact on their cultures. It's like these empires were giant melting pots simmering with, all these diverse flavors and ingredients.
Okay, I like that analogy. We touched on the Qawwat-ul-Islam Mosque in Delhi, that blend of Islamic and Hindu architecture.
Right.
What are some other examples of this cultural fusion?
Oh, there are tons. Like in Vijayanagara, you see temples that incorporate influences from all sorts of South Indian traditions. It's a real testament to the region's history of cultural exchange. And both empires, they saw these new literary and artistic styles emerge that blended elements from different cultures. It shows that cultures don't exist in these like vacuums. They're constantly interacting, influencing each other, changing.
It sounds like a pretty dynamic process.
Yeah.
But I imagine this exchange wasn't always smooth sailing, right?
Of course not.
Were there tensions?
Oh, yeah. I mean, whenever you have different cultures coming together, you're going to have clashes, misunderstandings, even conflict. The Delhi Sultanate, especially, they had these Islamic rulers governing a largely Hindu population. Navigating those cultural and religious differences, that must have been a real challenge. Remember the jizya, that tax on non-Muslims? That definitely caused some resentment.
You mentioned that some sultans adopted more tolerant policies
Yeah.
toward their Hindu subjects. Was that, genuine? Or was it more about keeping things stable? I mean, a ruler can't run an empire if a big chunk of the population is unhappy.
That's a great question. It's one that historians are still debating.
Right.
Was it real tolerance or just politics?
Yeah.
It was probably a mix of both. Some rulers, they were genuinely interested in, like, fostering interfaith harmony,
Yeah.
While others, they saw it as a way to keep things in order. And you see the same thing in Vijayanagara. They promoted Hinduism, but they also understood they needed to make room for other faiths, like Jainism, which had deep roots in the south.
So it's complicated.
Yeah.
Cultural exchange leads to all this innovation and these beautiful fusions,
Right.
but it also can create friction.
It's all part of history, right?
Yeah. It's messy, but it's fascinating.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into these two empires, the Delhi Sultanate and Vijayanagara, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to walk away with?
I think the main takeaway is that both of these empires, despite all their differences, they left this lasting impact on India. They shaped its culture, its politics, its identity. Like, even today, you can see the ruins of Vijayanagara's capital, and it's a testament to their achievements, right? And the Delhi Sultanate, they laid the groundwork for the Mughals, who'd later rule much of India.
It's amazing to think about those connections. These empires, they weren't just isolated events. They're part of this larger story.
Exactly. And that story, it's still unfolding in a way. We can see echoes of those empires in India's diversity, its languages, its art and architecture. That legacy, it's still with us.
Makes you wonder how much of what we think of as Indian culture today is a result of, what happened back then, all those exchanges and interactions.
It's a fascinating question, and it's one that historians are still exploring. But one thing's for sure, the Delhi Sultanate and Vijayanagara, they were major forces that shaped the destiny of India. They left behind a powerful legacy that continues to intrigue and inspire us.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into these two fascinating empires. It's been quite a journey, exploring all those different approaches to governing, to culture, to life itself.
It really has. It's been a pleasure diving into this with you. Hopefully our listeners are walking away with a little more knowledge, maybe some new questions, and a deeper appreciation for the rich history of India.
Absolutely. And that's what it's all about, sparking curiosity, encouraging people to learn and explore and appreciate just how complex the past really is. So until next time, keep those brains buzzing and those imaginations firing.